Thousands of focus points on our cameras. Why would you use each one of them, and how does it work?
Ask David Bergman.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Ask David Bergman. I'm David Bergman, here answering your photography questions. Don't forget to go to askdavidbergman.com, ask your own questions, and of course I will pick the best ones and answer them right here on a future show. Today I've got one from Don K, and he asked, how do you use the different focus points when you just want to focus on the eyes in a portrait? Focus points, boy, let me tell you, you can really do a deep dive when you start talking about autofocus settings on cameras. I actually did one in an early Ask David Bergman. Go back, I'll put a link below to that video if you want to see how I shoot action sports photography and all the different settings. When you're doing a portrait, like for example, today I'm here with Erica in Central Park. It's a beautiful day, she looks lovely, and we're going to make some portraits of her. Now, let me tell you what I'm shooting with. I'm using the EOS R Canon mirrorless. I have the battery grip on it. It's got extra batteries in it, I like that. And I'm also using the 24-105 RF lens that's made for the new one for the mirrorless. And on top here, this is the Atomos Ninja 2. It's an external monitor. The only reason I'm using that is so you guys can see what I'm shooting through the actual camera at the same time as I'm shooting it. Let's talk about focus points. Now, when you're shooting a portrait, for example, of Erica here, right? You can see that middle focus point, that's where my autofocus is going to look. Now, there are a lot of different ways you can set that. Right now I'm using the middle little center focus point. Let me show you on the menu where that is. That is right here. So that is 1 point AF, and by far that is the most accurate way to shoot, because that tiny little focus point only has a small area to look at, and it's going to be really fast and really accurate. The challenge with that is because it's so small, if I move off of her face even just a little bit, you can see it's going to zip out to that background really quickly. So it's really, you have to be really careful to make sure it's right where you want. You don't want it at the front of her nose. You don't want, I want it right at her eye in this case. So now, why would I use those thousands of different focus points? Well, with a camera like this actually has 5,655 individual autofocus points, which is crazy. The 1DX Mark II, for example, which is only a few years old, has 61, right? So every time they come out with a new generation, they add more focus points. And what that allows you to do is you can actually move that focus point anywhere you want in the frame. Why would you move it from one to the other? Honestly, I always have it either right in the middle or right about there, because when I'm shooting a portrait, you can see that is going to be right about where I have her eye in the frame. Her eyes are always going to be above the middle of the frame. So I like to put my focus points generally above center, because it gives me the best composition for that kind of a picture, right? So now, like I said before, I'm currently using the tiny little center point, but what I can do is I can go in and I can expand that. These next two are the expanded autofocus area. That's what Canon calls it. And what that does is now I'm still using the center point for focus, but it's those 8 little points around are just giving me a little leeway. So if I go off just a little bit, it's not going to immediately zip out onto that background, because it uses those outer points just as a little help for me. So if I can't hold the camera quite so steady, I have to really be off there for it to go to that background. But for the most part, it's going to keep me right where I want it to be. So that's really cool. Now, there's another way you can do this. You can go to zone autofocus, which is a much wider area, and then the camera is actually deciding what to focus on. So when you are have your autofocus activated, whatever's closest to the camera is going to be in focus. So it is constantly looking at that entire area and changing focus based on whatever's closest. So the problem with that is it takes control away from me. So for example, Erica, hold your arm out right in front of your face there. And when I do that, it's going to pick that closest part. Well, what if I don't want her hand in focus? So the way I shoot most of the time is I'm going to use that expanded AF area, and then I can choose to focus on her face even with her hand out in front of her body. So that way I'm taking the control back. I shoot 99.99% of the time with one of those two expanded autofocus modes, because it gives me the most control. I can pick and choose where I want, but it's a little wider than that tiny little center point, which is really hard to shoot with. So when we're doing portraits, there's also one more way to do it. Now, a lot of the newest cameras like this EOS R have face detection autofocus, which is right here. So that's a little face there, and you can select that, and then you can also turn on the eye detection so that it will actually look for the person's eye and will stay with her eye, and it's constantly going to be on at least one of her eyes, which is pretty insane that the computer inside the camera is constantly looking, realizing that it's a face, and choosing her eye to focus on. So it's brand new technology. It's getting better with every iteration. And the challenge with that is if you're not shooting a portrait, or if she turns around and there's no face, or she's the side of her head or something, it makes it a little more challenging. But in certain situations, eye autofocus works really, really well. So basically, to answer your question, you have to figure out what works for you, but those focus points give you a lot of different options and ways to shoot pictures, depending on the type of photography you do. Thanks so much for asking that question. If you have a question, don't forget, askdavidbergman.com. You'll find a listing of all my gear on there and a bunch of old episodes, so with all kinds of great information. Thanks so much for joining me. Please come back next week right here on Ask David Bergman.